Welcome to our brand new quarter in the Encounter Material Bible Study from our Cumberland Presbyterian Church. And I am so thankful today, very different kind of a Bible study today, because I have Reverend Jen Newell with me today. She is the author of 8 of the lessons in this quarter. And I always love it when I get to know an author. Sometimes I'll be listening to something on the radio or whatever and hear someone interviewed. And if I know something about the author, I'm much more likely to buy the book and maybe even understand the book a little better. And so I asked her if she would agree to lead us in this first session of this week. Jen is the pastor at First Cumberland Presbyterian in Cleveland, Tennessee. And she lives in Chattanooga, and as you know, I'm pastor of First Cumberland Presbyterian in Chattanooga, and we tease because I live in Cleveland, and we say that we wave at each other on the interstate as we're going to work every day. But Jen, for those that don't know you all that well, tell us a little bit about yourself.
All right. I am a product of First Cumberland Presbyterian Church in Chattanooga. That was the first grown-up church I went to as an adult. And it was there that I felt a sense of call to ministry, which I thought was the dumbest idea ever. And it was there I eventually gave in and said, all right, God, whatever it is you want, I'll do. And my time at First Cumberland, why is our church name so hard to say? It's all the same. My time at the Chattanooga church, how's that? Was a time for me to explore what my gifts were and weren't. And so apologies to any of you that had to deal with what my gifts weren't. I am married to Chuck. This will be 30 years in May. We've been married. And we have 3 grown-up children, Zoe, Evan, and Ellie. And a cat that sometimes I do like and sometimes I don't. I've been here for 15 years. I've been the pastor here for, 9 years? This will be 9 years this year. I was the associate pastor prior to that and the children's director prior to that. Before all this ministry stuff, I managed McKay Books in Chattanooga and then was their kind of corporate communications person. So I did a lot of writing for them. Nothing quite like this, though.
Well, thank you so much, both for writing these lessons and for doing this for me today. When I first became a pastor and was preaching every week, I discovered after some time that almost every week the same phrase was creeping into my sermon, or if I was doing a Bible study, I would say, this is one of my favorite passages of the Bible, or one of my favorite stories. And then I realized they were becoming my favorite because I was studying them and growing to love them and whatnot, and they weren't all my favorite, but just kind of felt that way. And the 8 lessons that you wrote are in some ways coming out of some of the favorite lessons that we all would have, or stories that we all would have. The lessons that you wrote are the Raising of Lazarus, and that's the one for this week. Jesus washing the disciples' feet. Jesus' arrest. Jesus before Pilate. And then after Easter, Paul on the Damascus Road, Paul and Silas in prison, and Paul in Athens. And so I wonder if you have a favorite or two among those, or did one or two become a new favorite?
Well, like you, every time I dig down into a passage of Scripture, I find something there to either really love or become so curious about to the point of distraction. I really, truly love studying the Bible. So sure, I think a lot of these are stories that I thought I knew well until I dug more deeply into them and realized how little I knew. Paul in Athens appeals to the bookish nerd in me, always will. Jesus washing the disciples' feet is intimate in an uncomfortable way, which I say, but then I realize I have gotten a pedicure before, which doesn't seem to bother me. But I think the one that really grabbed hold of me this time was Paul and Silas in prison, not so much because of the earthquake, but because they had this opportunity to make a choice with what they would do next. And for those of us who are used to the, when God opens the door sort of theology, you would have thought, well, God has opened the door, I should skedaddle. But they don't. They act in a way that's not in their self-interest, and they are discerning enough to understand that this open door is not what you think it is. And I really, that's made me think a whole lot about how I face opportunities that may come my way and how I discern those. So.
Good. Did a theme emerge for you maybe overall, or are there some particular takeaways that you got with these 8 lessons?
Well, the theme would be, it takes a long time to write these. That would be the theme. Not really. These aren't as connected by theme as some I've done in the past. I will say, though, that being forced to dig in and wrestle with Paul is probably good for me. A lot of us have strong opinions about Paul, and rarely are those well-informed opinions. People in my church know I always say, he's somebody I could never share an office with. Too bombastic, kind of passive-aggressive, really hardcore about things that would just exhaust me. But I really do appreciate digging into his story and trying to come to that without any preconceived notions, and kind of honoring the place that he was at as he made these decisions and said all these over-the-top things and created church where there was no church. So I think that was good for me to do that.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I've been using the visual Bible for several of our lessons in the Gospel of John. I really like the way they do that. And so let's look now at today's passage. It is the Raising of Lazarus from John, the 11th chapter. And so let's see that now.
A man named Lazarus, who lived in Bethany, became sick. Bethany was the town where Mary and her sister Martha lived. This Mary was the one who poured the perfume on the Lord's feet and wiped them with her hair. It was her brother, Lazarus, who was sick. The sisters sent Jesus the message, "Lord, your dear friend is sick." When Jesus heard it, he said, "The final result of this sickness will not be the death of Lazarus. This has happened in order to bring glory to God, and it will be the means by which the Son of God will receive glory." Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he received the news that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. Then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea."
Teacher, just a short time ago the people there wanted to stone you. And are you planning to go back?
A day has 12 hours, doesn't it? So those who walk in broad daylight do not stumble, for they see the light of this world. But if they walk during the night, they stumble, because they have no light. Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I will go and wake him up.
If he is asleep, Lord, he will get well.
Jesus meant that Lazarus had died, but they thought he meant natural sleep. So Jesus told them plainly,
Lazarus is dead. But for your sake, I am glad that I was not with him, so that you will believe. Let us go to him.
Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples,
Let us all go along with the teacher, so that we may die with him.
When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had been buried 4 days before. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Judeans had come to see Martha and Mary to comfort them about their brother's death. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed in the house.
If you had been here, Lord, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask him for.
Your brother will rise to life.
I know that he will rise to life on the last day.
I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me will live, even though they die. And those who live and believe in me will never die. Do you believe this?
Yes, Lord. I do believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who was to come into the world.
After Martha said this, she went back and called her sister Mary privately.
The teacher is here and is asking for you.
When Mary heard this, she got up and hurried out to meet him. Jesus had not yet arrived in the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. The people who were in the house with Mary, comforting her, followed her when they saw her get up and hurry out. They thought that she was going to the grave to weep there. Mary arrived where Jesus was, and as soon as she saw him, she fell at his feet.
Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died.
Jesus saw her weeping, and he saw how the people with her were weeping also. His heart was touched, and he was deeply moved.
Where have you buried him?
Come and see, Lord.
Jesus wept. See how much he loved him, the people said. But some of them said, he gave sight to the blind man, didn't he? Could he not have kept Lazarus from dying? Deeply moved once more, Jesus went to the tomb, which was a cave with a stone placed at the entrance.
Take the stone away.
There will be a bad smell, Lord. He has been buried 4 days.
Didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believed?
They took the stone away. Jesus looked up.
I thank you, Father, that you listened to me. I know that you always listen to me. But I say this for the sake of the people here, so that they will believe that you sent me.
After he had said this, he called out in a loud voice,
Lazarus! Come out!
He came out. His hands and feet wrapped in grave clothes, and with a cloth round his face.
Untie him and let him go.
Many of the people who had come to visit Mary saw what Jesus did, and they believed in him.
You know, I never really thought about Lazarus being sick, and I think that's something that really stood out to me in the video. I always jump ahead to dead Lazarus and forget that before that there was sick Lazarus, so that was an eye-opener.
Good, good. Well, that brings up a question, because in your lesson, one of the things you ask is, you say, is God's miraculous power a dusty relic of a long time ago in a faraway place? Do we imagine that God's life-restoring work is on hold until some future distant date? Or do we believe, as Jesus asks Martha to believe, that God is willing and able to utilize that sort of power right here and right now? And I'm wondering, first off, how have you or do you experience God's life-giving power?
So, I don't know if you've noticed in these lessons, but I am the queen of asking questions, not of answering them. I am very curious about everything I read, and I don't always have easy answers. I struggle with the whole big miracle thing. Not once in my life, and I've done a lot of funerals, have I stood over a casket and prayed for God to raise that person out of that casket. Never. Never. And if it happened, I'm sure I would have to be taken to the hospital in shock. I guess, and maybe this is something that I'm still learning. You know, when I see God at work, it's in smaller ways, but there's still ways that matter. In opening communication between people who normally wouldn't be able to relate to one another, in helping us break down walls of, one institution versus another, as it often seems to be, so that we can work together to do something good for God's kingdom. Those are little things, and I think my bias is always to look for the small and to appreciate it. So it may be that God is doing these big, huge things and I just am not paying attention. I don't know. But I do struggle with the big miracle thing. I say a lot, I know you can, God. I don't know why you won't.
Yeah.
Because you think about, well, Lazarus came back from the dead, and I sure would, like a little help here too. So.
You're talking about the small things. In Schindler's List, there's that quote where the character says to Schindler, who's saying, I wish I could have saved more, and he says that there's no Jewish proverb that to save one human life is to save the whole world. And so I wonder if God's life-saving power, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm hearing you maybe kind of say, well, I can see it in saving, being there, helping people in little acts that actually maybe are bigger miracles than we even know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. Well, what would you say to somebody like Martha who is really struggling? Maybe it feels like death is all around them. What would you say? How would you help them?
My first thought is that there are lots of things I wouldn't say. I think to not admit the truth of the difficulties of life is not helping anybody at all. Life is hard sometimes, and we want a deliverer, and we want rescue, and we want God to pluck us up out of there and put us over here in these gentle green pastures or whatever. And when I read, the more I read in the Bible, the more I see that although God does that some, more often what God is doing is walking with you through the hard times. So I am not alone. Life stinks sometimes. It just does. And sometimes it's heartbreaking and discouraging and frustrating, and God is there too. And so if there's a way to help people see God's presence and experience God's presence in the midst of that, I know that once their eyes are open to that God will handle the blessing and the peace and the grace that come along with knowing for sure that God is there. And I see that, I'm sure you do too, again and again, in the most surprising of situations. So.
Yeah, Martha, even when you said life stinks, if she says, he stinketh, talking about Lazarus, and that's the King James Version, but she proclaims that truth, and Jesus certainly doesn't sugarcoat it. So yeah, good. Well, one of the things that I was really struck in your lesson, and it kind of confirmed with you saying, I didn't think about Lazarus being sick, but he is raised from the dead, and yet in the lesson you say that the miracle isn't really the high point of the story, and you say the heart of the tale lies elsewhere. So tell me a little bit more about what you mean. Well, tell me more about that heart of this tale.
I think two things. First, I think that one thing I take away from this is that what is happening around me or to me is never as important as what's going on inside of me. That there is this, God is at work within us, transforming us from the inside out, whether the outside situation changes or not. The other thing is really the core of this story is not that Lazarus is raised from the dead, it's that Jesus is the resurrection, Jesus is the life. He is present right here and now in a life-giving way against all the odds. So I think the focus very much is on him, and then as an outgrowth of that, he raises Lazarus, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah, so. Indeed. Well, another thing about the lesson I just love, you really helped me think a little new about Mary and Martha. And there has been, in the other story we have of the two of them, this idea of Mary being the active disciple, and Martha being the active disciple, and Mary being a little more of the passive disciple. And sometimes I think Martha gets a bad rap about that and that kind of thing. But in this story particularly, you point out some rather radical ways that John is telling this story and that Jesus is reacting to the women. And if you don't mind, just share that with us again.
Yeah, so it's pretty obvious when you read this that this is not the normal way you would talk about a village. They say Bethany is Mary and Martha's village, that it's their home, as opposed to the house of someone who would be their father, their brother, their husband, whatever. It's not even Lazarus' home, it's their home. And so this really gives us a glimpse of some realities of life that maybe we don't think much about, because it wouldn't have been typical in the day for you to refer to any property as belonging to a woman, or any place as being really associated more with a woman than with a man. But Jesus here is operating even on these sort of marginal outside, edges of what acceptable society looks like. These women clearly had power, position, some wealth to be able to have a home that was theirs, and that definitely wasn't the norm, and that did not change Jesus's relationship with them at all. So.
And in fact, that they had a very special relationship, that except for the unnamed disciple whom Jesus loved, these are the only three in the Gospel of John that are said that he loves them. They have this special relationship. And I do love the fact that he could have just said to Mary and Martha, well, I'm not going to talk to you, you're just a woman. But obviously he didn't. He had a special relationship with them. What do you make of that, and why do you think that John told us, that gave us that particular detail?
So I think John is all about fleshing out what it means to be the Word made flesh, the incarnation. Mm-hmm. And when I see this special relationship called out, I think about, we have prayer request time at our church, and you may have that too, and somebody will say, my cousin's secretary's niece's dog groomer had a heart attack.
Right.
Okay, and they may give you a name, and in no way am I saying that that's not worth praying about. It is, but there's distance there between me and the cousin's niece's dog groomers, whatever. There's a distance, and so I may pray for them, and I will pray for them, but not the same way as if it were my cousin or my best friend. And to see here, Jesus is not just healing unnamed crowds of random people who show up, but in the context of this relationship, he is going, and it's not just that he brings Lazarus back. He listens to these sisters. He hears what's on their heart. He empathizes with them, and he makes a change. He's very close to the situation. And I think for me as a pastor, and I don't know how it is for you, but sometimes I feel very blessed by that closeness, but sometimes I realize I need to take a step back in order to be effective in my job. A funeral can't be about my particular feelings, right? Or anything. But I love that he is navigating this relationship where he has deep feelings for these people and still is able to act. So.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you. That's great. Well, I also learned a lot from you telling us a little bit about some of the Jewish death rituals and how that factored into this story. And so if you don't mind, I'm just going to let you tell us a little bit about that as well.
So I'm the sort of person who, if I have to do a big lesson, will go and circle all the words I want to look up. And then I go back and I look them up as much as I possibly can. Go down every rabbit trail I have time to go down. And this was a real surprise to me. I had never before heard some of these things. I knew that burial took place quickly because they didn't embalm bodies, and so it was as soon as possible, and that's even true today for Jewish people. As soon as possible you bury the person. And I knew that there were caves and there were tombs that were hewn out of rock and all that stuff. Anybody who grew up in church knows that. What I didn't know was that there was a common belief among people at that time that your soul hung out for a few days, for 3 days. And then once it saw your face had changed color, it realized it couldn't reunite with your body and it would leave you. And that was a surprise to me. But I you think about why you might have had that belief, and surely you might assume someone is dead who wasn't dead. Sometimes they didn't have all of the ways we have to monitor, body functions and that kind of stuff. And so maybe that's one way that you kind of could explain those situations where someone may be comatose or something, and then all of a sudden they're back. But I thought that was really interesting.
Somebody just the other day was telling me, and I don't know if this is true, but the term "saved by the bell" is from when people in I guess this culture or in times past though would be buried and they wouldn't be dead yet, and they would put a string going into the grave with a bell on it so they could ring the bell if they woke up in the grave, and that's how you're saved. And that's kind of what you're saying there about the kind of wait the 3 days before the soul would even depart. And when I read that in your lesson, it occurred to me, and wow, that makes it significant that Jesus didn't get there until 4 days, because now everybody, even Lazarus in a sense, has given up all hope of him being raised up from the dead, and yet Jesus can and does act in that time. And it really reminded me, I've got a friend who's a singer-songwriter, and he has a line in one of his songs. He's actually talking about Jesus, of course, but he says, "I'll meet you there by the tomb to see if sometimes we don't give up one day too soon." And that line has brought a lot of hope in my life. And I know this is kind of a hard question, and it doesn't have an easy answer. And if there was an easy answer, it would be it's going to be incomplete or not true. But as a pastor, when you encounter somebody who seems to be facing what is just an absolute lost cause, it may be that loved one has died, or they're suffering through the death of a marriage, or whatever, and they're losing hope, what can you say or do for them to help them have hope, even if their hope isn't for a literal resurrection of their loved one, or a reconciliation in their marriage, or whatever the problem might be?
So summarize in 2 sentences the hardest part of the job?
Yeah, there you go.
Perfect, yeah. That's so hard. It's so hard. Hope is such a fragile thing sometimes, and I would never want to not honor the depth of the loss. We grieve in all sorts of ways. We don't just grieve in a tomb. We grieve the loss of a relationship. We grieve the loss of dreams that we've had for a long time. If you have an older parent you've had to take their car keys away from them, they're grieving that. There's lots of moments of disorienting grief. And I think it's Walter Brueggemann who talks about so much about grief as being disorienting, and about life as being fundamentally disorienting. And I think it's his book on the Psalms where he talks about God again and again just reorients us and reorients us. And so for me, that process of walking through that tough time with somebody is, trying to be discerning enough to gently help them reorient in God's direction. My circumstances, the things that happen to me and around me, are not the lens I should use to judge whether or not God is still there, or whether or not God loves me. That's a really shallow, dangerous way to view God. I think God is always present and always, as we say, as Paul says in Romans, at work for something good for those who are called. If we're in on the plan, his plan is good, So gently, lovingly, and as the time seems right, being able to point out some of the good, and to turn people toward something that reorients them and helps them see that God is actively involved in their lives and hasn't given up on them, I guess is the goal.
Yeah. A couple things that brings up for me when you're talking about walking with somebody, and this isn't just for pastors, this can be for anybody, of course, that makes me think of the 23rd Psalm. When I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, there's a promise I'm going through, but you are with me. And sometimes the you that is with me is God, but it's God in the person in the form of another person who is helping us and walking us through it. So that's I think beautiful, and we can think about how we can walk with people, maybe rather than trying to fix their problem. Recognize we've got to go through this valley, but you're going to go through it with me. And then the other thing that really resonates with me when you talk about Brueggemann is he talks about when you get reoriented, it always comes as a surprise. And good grief, that's what this story is all about. Lazarus is dead and buried and gone. He's been gone for 4 days, and so everybody's lost hope, and yet the reorientation is a huge surprise. And so even if it's not going to be that the person is going to be literally resurrected, there will be that time when we're surprised by grace, to use C.S. Lewis's phrase, surprised by God's presence, and we just walk with Him until and maybe surprised again and again and again too. It's not that you just finally end up on the other side. I don't think so. Good.
Yeah, and I think that's not trying to approach people as a problem to be solved, or to think that you are the problem solver, which is one of my big issues I have to work on, is really helpful, because that surprise can't be forced. That's going to come as you're open to seeing God at work in your life. That surprise will come, but I can't force it.
Right, yeah.
So
no more than Martha could force Jesus to come early.
That's right.
And do something.
Exactly
right.
right.
Yeah, good, wonderful. Well, another thing I learned from your lesson, I did not know, but I was very interested. The Greek word for that famous verse, Jesus wept. When Jesus sees Mary and the others and how upset they are, he weeps. But the Greek there, you say, means to snort with anger as the horses. And I know those angry horse snorts pretty well. But to have that bit of anger in that Jesus weeping, it was new to me. And I'm still trying to think through this a little bit. You offered several suggestions as to what he might be feeling. You might want to share those with us. And then I know you say you like to ask questions, but I do want to ask what you think as well, what you think might be going on there. So what are some of those possibilities, and where are you coming down right now on what might be happening there?
So this is where the word study just goes all wrong. It's not what I expected at all.
Yeah.
I was like, what kind of weeping? What depth of weeping? Where else is this found? And then I find this. There's certainly a snorting horse is a very powerful image. That's not a tiny little sort of, it's not something you're going to not notice, you know? So there's an intensity of emotion there. I mean, I was trying to sort out, and all I did in the lesson was try to sort out what possible reason could there be to be angry or that deeply moved. Is he angry about his own impending death? Is that it? It doesn't seem like that's it, because he seems to be pretty much at peace with that. Is he angry at the power of sin and death and the way that affects the people he loves? Again, he knows how this is going to end. He said it before he even got there. He's like, Lazarus is dead, but this is good for you, because you're going to get to see something. Is he angry because of Mary's lack of faith, because of the people around her, their lack of faith? Is he angry because there's so many people around and he really just wanted some time alone with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus? I don't know. But if you think about what anger is, in part, it's dissatisfaction with things as they are. It's also a lot of energy. You know, I mean, when people struggle with anger, one thing I try to say is, there's energy behind that, and maybe that's the energy you need to make a change. And so I don't know if that was just sort of like this energizing moment that helped Jesus, steel his nerves even more to continue on, to Jerusalem, because whether he was fully at peace with the plan of God and 100% on board or not, wasn't easy. I mean, if we think it was easy, we're discounting the incarnational nature of Jesus. He was fully human too. Nobody wants to look ahead and say, all right, I got a couple more weeks and then all these terrible things are going to happen. Nobody walks into that easily. So I don't know if that's it. I really don't know. But I appreciate the intensity of it.
Yeah, good. Yeah. Well, and that kind of brings up too, this is, the last and most dramatic of the miracles, and John calls them signs in John's gospel. And you also note that the miracle is only temporary. Bruce Clark, our organist at First Cumberland, was just the other day telling a story about how his mother at one point got really, really sick, and she was comatose, and they were pretty sure she was about to die. And then after a couple of days, she made kind of a dramatic recovery. And when she first woke up and kind of realized that she hadn't died, she said, "You mean I've got to die all over again?" And she lived several more years, I think. But that's kind of was Lazarus' experience. He dies, and then he is resurrected, but it is temporary. He's not still wandering around. So at some point in the future, after this, he died again. So I wonder if, however, if you can make comparisons and contrast to, and obviously I've just made one, but to Lazarus' resurrection and then the resurrection of Jesus.
Well, I mean, the the obvious one is that Jesus' resurrection lasted, right? It's interesting too because before Jesus died and before he was resurrected, he was really singled out as an enemy and as a threat. But after Lazarus was resurrected, not before, he becomes a threat too, because he becomes this walking, talking billboard for this Jesus that the Pharisees and the scribes already don't trust. This is power that's beyond their control. It's not fitting into their narrative. It's a threat. And he is a visible reminder of that threat. So it's, it's kind of bittersweet to me. Here he gets his second chance at life, and now he's like a wanted man,
Yeah.
Of course, what Jesus did was, for Lazarus, was he said it was to show everybody more about who he was. That's why these miracles are signs. And, John and Lazarus benefited, but what Jesus did for us is kind of the ultimate sign. I mean, that permanent resurrection, that eternal life that lives on despite the tomb is something that matters to all of us, not just Lazarus and Mary and Martha. So.
Yeah, well, that's part of the effect that this had on his life. You noted in the lesson that Martha fails to see how Jesus saying, "I am the resurrection and the life," applies to her right now. She says, "Well, I know he'll be resurrected sometime in the future," but she misses kind of life that Jesus is offering right then and there. And you suggest that many of us might miss the same thing, particularly if we see our faith just as a get out of hell pass. Or something like that we're probably missing what Jesus has for us now. And so I really wonder how you think that Jesus telling Martha and us, "I'm the resurrection and the life," might apply to us right now and not only about some resurrection in the future.
Oh, yeah. What a good question I asked. So I think about what life is. I mean, growth, nourishment, an expansive sort of openness to the world around us, right? Jesus said he came that we would have life and have it more abundantly. And in churches, we become so concerned with the maintenance of our institutions that I think we often turn in on ourselves and miss out on the lively openness that Jesus wants for us because it looks too risky. I think the two biggest devils that we face in church life are safety and security, and then good stewardship. And I'm all for safety and I'm all for good stewardship. But in the name of either one of those, we can choose to close in on ourselves rather than to be open to what God's asking us to do, because he's a risk taker from our perspective, not from his. He knows what he's doing, but his ways aren't our ways, right? So I also think about where else I'm looking for life. Am I looking for life in my career, in accomplishments I have, in respect out in the community, in relationship? Why am I not looking for that, like the core of life in Christ? Why am I taking that so for granted? I think we run the risk of being lazy Christians because I grew up in the church. I've always known these stories. I don't see the value of it because it's so much a part of the fabric of my life. And I think if we could step it back somehow and see the value of what God offers, we might be willing to take hold of that and say, yes, I treasure where Jesus is leading me is a treasure, and what he's doing in my life is a treasure. So.
That's beautiful. And that idea of taking risk resonates with me a little bit. I'm reflecting that both Martha and Mary come out to Jesus, and I think I'm pretty confident they're mad at him when they both say the same thing. If you had been here, and I can imagine them putting their finger in his face. And that actually gives us permission, I think, to sometimes recognize that I can say to Jesus, if you would just do what I want you to do, and then let's see how is Jesus going to respond to me, rather than playing it safe and holding back. And they, in a sense, they were risking community with Jesus, and then Jesus really restores their whole community in a sense. So that's powerful. Thank you. Well, wrapping up, when I was in one of my educational opportunities one time, I remember a preaching professor saying that every sermon should lead us to be or to do something. It's not enough just to get a few nice little facts or have a nice little story, and we've already learned a lot of that today. But I wonder, just to kind of close up, if you would tell us what this this passage is either leading you to be or to do, or what do you think it might lead us to be or to do?
I think as a pastor, a lot of the news that people share with me is bad news. You don't call your pastor to say, hey, something awesome happened today. You call to say, I'm in a crisis. There's an issue. We're at the hospital. Somebody died. And that's our space. That's the space we occupy. And it's an honor to occupy that space. But to remember that in that space where there is heartache and concern and even death, that we are there to point them to Jesus, who is the life, who is the resurrection. That my job is not the same as the doctor's job, or the lawyer's job, or the policeman's job, or the undertaker's job. My job is to be there as a visible reminder, like Lazarus. I'm a visible, touchy-feely reminder of this bigger truth, that Jesus is the resurrection and the life. And so whatever I can do to help magnify that story should become my responsibility, my job. So for me personally, that's what I get out of it. I'm not sure what else to say.
Well, I will say you have been pastor to me over these last few years in that way, and you are pastor to all of us right now through these lessons. And I can see, when I read this lesson, I could hear your voice. You write like you talk, which is great. And so I thank you for today, and I thank you for what's coming up this quarter. Thank you for all the hard work you put into this.
Well, thank you. It was fun to talk.
It has been fun. Thanks.